When we talk about the global drug trade, the conversation usually begins and ends with one image: the drug dealer. Perhaps a young man on a street corner. Perhaps a courier at an airport. Perhaps a Nigerian suspect arrested somewhere in Europe. And then we attach a nationality to the crime. But tonight, I want us to ask a much more uncomfortable question. Who actually runs the drug trade? Because a global industry worth billions cannot be understood simply by looking at the person carrying the package. Follow the money. Who produces the drugs? Who finances production? Who controls transportation routes? Who provides the logistics? Who launders the proceeds? Who moves billions through legitimate financial systems? And perhaps most importantly, who creates the demand? The person caught with the drugs may be the most visible part of the operation, but visibility is not the same thing as power. This episode is therefore not about defending criminals. Crime is crime, and Nigerians who participate in drug trafficking must be held accountable. But accountability requires us to understand the entire system. If we only focus on the courier, we see the bottom of the pyramid. If we follow the money, we begin to see the architecture. And that is where this episode takes us, not toward another stereotype, toward the system behind the stereotype. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind Griot Wave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. Griot Wave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. If crime has no capital city, why do we keep looking for one? We often talk about crime as though it belongs somewhere. Mexico becomes synonymous with cartels, Italy with the mafia, Japan with the yakuza, Nigeria with fraud, Colombia with cocaine. But crime does not respect borders. It moves through production centers, transportation routes, financial systems, ports, cities, banks, and markets. And that changes the question. Instead of asking, which country has the criminals, we should be asking, how does the entire system work? Because when we follow the evidence, something becomes clear. Different regions occupy different positions within different criminal economies. One country may be a production hub. Another may be a transit corridor. Another may provide the financial infrastructure. Another may be the consumer market. And another may simply be where the criminal finally gets caught. That last point matters. The person arrested is not necessarily the person with the greatest power in the network. So in this episode, we're going to remove nationality from the center of the investigation. We're going region by region, market by market, and money trail by money trail. No excuses for Nigerian criminals. No demonization of Nigerians. No romanticizing criminals anywhere. Just one standard: follow the evidence. Because if the evidence tells a more complicated story than the stereotype, then perhaps it's time we change the story. We cleared one country's name last episode, but that raises a much bigger question. If we're going to challenge stereotypes about Nigerians, are we prepared to apply exactly the same standard to everyone else? That's what we're doing here. No selective outrage, no replacing one stereotype with another, and no convenient statistics chosen simply because they support our argument. We're putting the major categories of transnational crime on the map: drug trafficking, human trafficking, cybercrime, money laundering, financial fraud, arms trafficking, organized crime. And we're applying one rule to every country. If we make a claim, we source it. If we can't substantiate it, it doesn't make the map. Because there's a fundamental problem with the way we often discuss international crime. We confuse visibility with ownership. A country can become highly visible in one particular crime without being the global center of that crime. And criminal networks don't operate like national football teams. They don't stop at the border. A supply chain can begin in one country, pass through several others, use financial infrastructure somewhere else, and ultimately generate its profits in a completely different market. So the real question isn't, which country is the criminal country? The real question is, what infrastructure allows this crime to function? And when we follow that infrastructure, something becomes very difficult to ignore. There is no single capital of global crime. There is a network. And that network is much bigger and much more complicated than any national stereotype. So let's put every country under the same microscope. Before we start naming countries, we need to establish something very important. This is not a hunt for villains. It is an investigation of systems. We are going to build a map of transnational crime using 4 layers. First, drug production and trafficking. Where are drugs produced? Where do they travel? And where are the major consumer markets? Second, cybercrime. Not simply where criminals are arrested, but where different forms of cybercrime originate, operate, and generate revenue. Third, money laundering. Because criminal money has to go somewhere. It enters businesses, financial systems, property markets, trade networks, and other channels where illicit proceeds can be concealed or transformed. And fourth, Human trafficking. Here we examine the routes, recruitment systems, destinations, and exploitation markets that allow trafficking networks to operate across borders. But there is a rule that matters more than all 4 layers. Every pin is sourced. We're not putting a country on this map because somebody said it on social media. We're not using a sensational headline as proof. And we're certainly not using a stereotype as evidence. Where possible, we're going back to institutions such as UNODC, Interpol, FATF, and the Tax Justice Network, alongside other credible datasets and research. If the evidence doesn't support the claim doesn't make the map. There is another important decision here. Regions, not stereotypes. Why? Because the moment we put one nationality under a microscope while leaving everyone else outside the frame, we've already compromised the investigation. So we're going to examine patterns, region by region. And here's what I want you to watch for as we move through this map. Where does the crime begin? Where does it move? Where does the money go? And who ultimately benefits? Because the person we see on the news may be at the end of a chain that crosses several borders. That distinction is critical. A courier is not necessarily the financier. A producer is not necessarily the organizer. A country used as a transit route is not necessarily the destination market. And a person arrested in one country does not automatically tell us where the wider network is headquartered. So throughout this episode, we're going to resist the temptation to ask, which country is the problem? Instead, we're asking, what does the evidence reveal about the network? And once we start looking at crime this way, the map becomes much more interesting. Because the story is no longer about one nation. It's about infrastructure, incentives, money and demand operating across borders. When most people hear the words drug trafficking, they immediately picture the person carrying the drugs. The courier, the street dealer, the person arrested at an airport. But that is only one point on a much larger supply chain. Think about any global industry. There is production, there is transportation, there are distributors, there are markets, there are financial systems, and there are consumers. The illegal drug economy works in much the same way. Cocaine, heroin, synthetic drugs, and other illicit substances can move through multiple countries before reaching the final consumer. So the critical question is not simply, where was this person arrested? It is, where did the chain begin, how did it move, and where did the money ultimately go? This matters enormously when we talk about Nigeria, because Nigerian nationals have certainly been involved in drug trafficking. That is a documented reality, and we should not deny it. But documenting Nigerian involvement is very different from claiming that Nigerians somehow own the global drug trade. They don't. No single country does. The global drug economy has multiple production centers, trafficking routes, transit countries, distribution networks, and consumer markets. And those roles can change over time. Some countries are associated with production, others with transit, others with major consumer markets, others with financial services and money laundering. And sometimes the same country can occupy several positions simultaneously. So as we examine the evidence, I want you to resist one temptation. Don't look for a villain. Look for the supply chain. Because once we stop asking, which nationality is responsible, and start asking, how does this network actually function, the picture becomes much more complicated. And that complexity is precisely the point. A global criminal economy cannot be accurately explained by attaching it to one nationality. The drugs may cross borders, the money may cross even more, and the people who ultimately profit may be nowhere near the person who gets caught. So let's follow the chain, not the stereotype. Now we can begin to see why the phrase, the Nigerian drug problem, is such an inadequate description of a global phenomenon. Look at this map. We have South America, where cocaine production is concentrated. We have the Middle East and North Africa, where the Captagon trade became a major synthetic drug economy centered around Syria. And beyond these regions are the transit routes, distribution networks, and consumer markets that complete the chain. The important point is not simply that drugs exist in different parts of the world. It is that different regions perform different functions within the same global economy. And then we have the number at the bottom. 316 million people aged 15 to 64 used an illicit drug in 2023. That number changes the conversation. Because trafficking is not sustained by supply alone. There must be demand. Behind every shipment is a market. Behind every market are consumers. And behind the consumers are economies capable of absorbing billions of dollars in illicit products. So when we see a Nigerian courier arrested in Europe, for example, we are seeing one individual at one point in a much larger chain. That person may be guilty. They may deserve prosecution. But their nationality does not explain the entire supply chain. And this is where our investigation becomes uncomfortable. If we want to understand the drug economy, we have to look beyond who gets caught and examine where production occurs, where demand exists, how trafficking routes function, and where the money ultimately ends up. The map also demonstrates something else. Crime does not respect the boundaries of our stereotypes. No single region owns drug trafficking. No single nationality owns it. And no single country can explain it. So keep that in mind as we move across this map. We are not looking for a country to blame. We are following the architecture of a global market. And once you follow the architecture, the story becomes considerably harder to reduce to a stereotype. Let's put the argument aside for a moment and simply look at the numbers. 3,708 tons of cocaine. That is the estimated global production figure for 2023 presented in the UNODC World Drug Report 2025. And then we have another number, 33%. A one-year increase from 2022, concentrated in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. Those figures immediately challenge one of the assumptions behind the Nigerian stereotype. Because if we are talking about cocaine production, the evidence points us towards South America. That doesn't mean Nigeria has no role in cocaine trafficking. It means we need to distinguish between production, transit, distribution, and consumption. Those are not the same thing. A Nigerian involved somewhere along a trafficking route does not suddenly transform Nigeria into the world's cocaine production center. And this distinction matters because public discussions about crime often collapse an entire supply chain into the nationality of whoever gets arrested. Imagine a legitimate international supply chain. A product might be manufactured in one country, shipped through another, financed somewhere else, and sold in a completely different market. We wouldn't normally say that the country where the delivery driver was arrested owns the entire industry. Why should we analyze criminal networks differently? The other figure on this slide is equally important. A 33% increase in production. That tells us this isn't simply a story about individual criminals. It is a story about capacity, demand, money, and organized networks operating at enormous scale. And that brings us back to the central question of this episode. Who really runs the drug trade? The answer cannot be found by looking only at the person carrying the package. We have to follow the entire chain. Production, trafficking, distribution, demand, money, and ultimately profit. Because if we want to challenge stereotypes honestly, we cannot simply replace Nigerians or drug dealers with another simplistic claim. We have to do something much more powerful. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. And in the cocaine economy, the first major piece of evidence leads us directly to South America. Here is where our investigation gets more interesting. We have established where much of the cocaine is produced, but production is not the same thing as profit. So where does the money actually go? Imagine the cocaine economy as a supply chain. At the beginning are the growers and producers. They cultivate the coca and produce the raw material. But despite taking enormous risks, they typically capture only a fraction of the final value generated by the drug once it reaches wealthy consumer markets. Then comes the second layer. Traffickers and logistics networks. This is where geography becomes important. Drugs move through borders, ports, transport networks, and transit hubs. Those networks can span Central America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and Europe before reaching major consumer markets. And notice something. There is no single nationality operating this entire chain. Different groups can control different stages. Then we reach the third layer. Retail markets and financial intermediaries. This is where the economics become particularly revealing. The final retail price can be dramatically higher than the value of the product at its point of production. And once criminal proceeds are generated, another problem appears. How do you turn illegal money into usable wealth? That is where money laundering becomes crucial. Criminal proceeds can be moved through businesses, property, trade transactions, shell companies, informal networks, and financial institutions. So if we only focus on the person carrying a package across a border, we are looking at the smallest visible piece of a much larger economic system. This is why I keep saying, follow the money, not just the leaf. Because the real question isn't simply who grows the coca. It is, who captures the value? Who controls the logistics? Who controls access to the consumer? Who launders the proceeds? And ultimately, who converts criminal revenue into lasting wealth? That is the distinction between seeing a drug trade as a collection of criminals and understanding it as a global criminal economy. And once we follow the money, the stereotype becomes much harder to sustain. The person at the bottom of the chain may be the easiest person to see. They are not necessarily the person with the most power. We have just looked at cocaine, and the evidence took us to South America. Now let's move to a completely different drug economy, Captagon. For more than a decade, Syria was identified as the principal source of illicitly manufactured Captagon, an amphetamine-type stimulant that became deeply embedded in the regional drug market. UNODC reports that most Captagon originated in Syria, with Lebanon also playing a role. And this is where the story becomes particularly important for our investigation. Because this was not simply a story about a street dealer. It became a story about industrial-scale production, organized trafficking, political power, and money. Estimates cited by Reuters put the global Captagon trade at around $10 billion annually, with estimates that the former Syrian leadership may have profited by billions. Those figures are estimates, not audited accounts, so we should treat them as such. Then came December 2024. The Assad government fell, and investigators discovered large-scale Captagon manufacturing facilities inside Syria. UNODC subsequently reported that production had been disrupted, but trafficking did not simply disappear. Seizures in 2024 and early 2025 showed that Captagon continued moving through established routes. That tells us something fundamental about criminal economies. Removing one part of a network does not automatically eliminate the market. Networks adapt, routes change, production can move, stockpiles can enter circulation, and demand continues to create economic incentives. So when we talk about Nigerian involvement in international drug trafficking, this is the perspective we need to maintain. We're not comparing Nigerian individuals with Syrian citizens. We're comparing systems of organized crime. We're asking what happens when criminal enterprise becomes connected to logistics, political structures, financial networks, and regional demand. And that's why this case matters. It demonstrates that the global drug economy can become deeply intertwined with institutions, conflict, and political power. The lesson isn't that one nationality is worse than another. The lesson is far more important. Crime can become an industry. And when it becomes an industry, the person carrying the drugs may be only the most visible, and sometimes the least powerful, part of the business. So again, don't just look at the package. Look at the network behind it. After everything we've seen, let's step back and ask the simplest question. Where is the capital of the global drug trade? The answer is uncomfortable. There isn't one. Look at the two examples we've examined. In South America, cocaine production is heavily concentrated in the Andean region. Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia are central to the cultivation and production side of the cocaine economy, while trafficking routes extend far beyond the region. Current UNODC data shows that cocaine trafficking is concentrated particularly in the Americas and Western Europe, with multiple departure and destination countries involved. Now move to the Middle East. Captagon tells a very different story. Production was concentrated principally in Syria, and, to a lesser extent, Lebanon, while the major destination markets have been in the Arabian Peninsula. Even after the political transition in Syria, UNODC reports that trafficking flows persisted, demonstrating how adaptable these networks can be. Two different drugs, two different production environments, two different regional networks, and yet both belong to the same global phenomenon. That's the point. There is no single country that explains the drug economy. There are production centers, there are transit corridors, there are distribution networks, there are consumer markets, and there are financial systems through which criminal proceeds move. So when someone says, Nigerians are drug dealers, the intellectually honest response isn't to pretend Nigerian involvement doesn't exist. It does. The question is whether that involvement justifies turning an entire population into a criminal category. The evidence says the global drug market is much more complicated than that. In fact, UNODC describes today's drug markets as increasingly adaptive, with criminal groups operating across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas, and changing their business models in response to geopolitical and economic conditions. So remember the principle we've established. Don't ask which nationality owns crime. Ask, where is the production? Where is the demand? Where are the routes? Where does the money move? And most importantly, who benefits? Because once we stop looking for a single criminal capital and start examining the entire network, one thing becomes clear. Crime has no nationality. And therefore, neither should a stereotype. If the drug trade showed us that crime can cross borders, cybercrime takes that principle to another level. There may be no border at all. A criminal can sit in one country, target a victim in another, route communications through several jurisdictions, move stolen money through cryptocurrency or financial intermediaries, and disappear before the victim even understands what happened. That changes the entire meaning of where the crime happened. Is it where the criminal was sitting? Where the victim lived? Where the server was located? Where the money was transferred? Or where the proceeds were finally laundered? There may be no single answer. The United Nations describes cybercrime as encompassing both cyber-dependent offenses, such as malware and ransomware, and cyber-enabled crimes, such as fraud. It specifically highlights how these offenses transcend geographical boundaries. And this is important for our discussion about Nigeria. Yes, Nigerians have been involved in online fraud. That is a real problem, and pretending otherwise would undermine this entire series. But Nigerian involvement is not the same thing as Nigerian ownership of cybercrime. The modern cybercriminal economy is increasingly organized like an industry. UNODC has documented a growing criminal service economy, where specialized groups provide services to other criminals, including infrastructure, laundering, and technical capabilities. And the scale is enormous. Recent UNODC findings on Southeast Asia estimated that scam operations caused between $88.3 billion and $114.1 billion in losses during 2025. These networks increasingly operate across borders and connect fraud with money laundering, trafficking, and other crimes. Think about what that means. This isn't simply a Nigerian scammer sends an email. It can be an international criminal ecosystem, recruiters, data brokers, social engineers, technical specialists, money launderers, cryptocurrency intermediaries, victims, and sometimes, tragically, people who are themselves trafficked and forced into conducting scams. So once again, we have to ask the bigger question. Are we looking at a nationality, or are we looking at an ecosystem? Because the internet has fundamentally changed criminal geography. A criminal network doesn't need a physical headquarters in the traditional sense. It needs access, technology, data, money, and people. And those resources can be distributed across the planet. So when somebody tells you that cybercrime is a Nigerian problem, remember what the evidence tells us. Nigeria has a cybercrime problem, but the world has a cybercrime economy. And those are two very different statements. The internet didn't eliminate borders. It made criminals much better at ignoring them. Now we move from physical geography to digital geography. And this is where the idea of a crime capital becomes even harder to defend. Look at the figures on this map. For the periods shown, tracked cyber attacks associated with online resources in the United States accounted for roughly 34%, while Russia accounted for about 8%, and France about 7%. But we need to be extremely careful about what these numbers actually mean. Origin does not automatically mean criminal nationality. A cyber attack can be routed through compromised computers, rented infrastructure, proxy servers, or other systems. The location associated with an attack is therefore not necessarily the physical location of the person who planned or carried it out. That distinction is critical, because imagine we use the same logic everywhere else. If a criminal uses a server in Britain, does that make them British? If they route an attack through America, does that make America responsible? If stolen money passes through an account in another country, does that make the account holder the mastermind? Obviously not, and that is precisely why cybercrime exposes the weakness of simplistic national stereotypes. Nigeria has a well-documented problem with online fraud. We should acknowledge it. But the data on this slide demonstrates something much bigger. Cybercrime is distributed across the global digital infrastructure. The United States appears prominently in this dataset. So do Russia, France, the Netherlands, Brazil, Switzerland, Britain, Germany, and several Asian countries. That doesn't mean these populations are criminal. It means their digital infrastructure is connected to observed attack activity. And that distinction is the entire lesson. We cannot say Nigeria has scammers, therefore Nigerians are scammers. Any more than we can say, America appears prominently in cyber attack origin data, therefore Americans are hackers. The first statement is a stereotype. The second would be equally absurd. The correct conclusion is much more interesting. Cybercrime follows technology, connectivity, infrastructure, opportunity, and money, not nationality. And once again, our rule survives. Don't follow the stereotype. Follow the evidence. Because on the internet, geography can tell us where the attack appears to come from. It does not necessarily tell us who is behind the keyboard. Now this is where the numbers become uncomfortable. At first glance, the chart appears to give us a very simple story. The United States accounts for a significant share of tracked cyber attack origins, Russia follows, France follows, and the remaining attacks are spread across the rest of the world. But before we draw any conclusions, there is an important methodological point. This is not a ranking of criminal nationalities. The underlying Kaspersky/Statista dataset measures the geographical location of online resources associated with detected attacks. In other words, it tells us where the digital infrastructure appeared to be located, not necessarily where the individual criminal was sitting or what nationality they possessed. Statista. And that distinction is absolutely crucial. A server can be compromised. An attacker can use someone else's infrastructure. Traffic can be routed through multiple jurisdictions. So saying that an attack originated from an IP address in a particular country is not the same thing as saying the citizens of that country committed the attack. Now look at the broader pattern. The dataset shows substantial activity associated with the United States, Russia, France, and numerous other countries. The published figures actually put the US share at approximately 33.8%, Russia at 7.9%, and France at 7.3% for November 2022 to October 2023. Statista. That means we should also be careful with the simplified 25% figure displayed here. If this presentation is going to be published as a research-driven documentary, I would update that number to the underlying published figure, or clearly explain the different calculation. But the bigger lesson remains. If we use the logic sometimes applied to Nigeria, a crime is associated with infrastructure in country X, therefore country X's people are criminals. We would immediately produce absurd conclusions. We wouldn't say Americans are hackers because American-hosted resources appear prominently in the dataset. We wouldn't say Russians are hackers because Russia appears near the top. And we certainly wouldn't say the French are cyber criminals because France appears in the data. So why apply that logic to Nigerians? The standard has to be the same. Nigeria has a serious online fraud problem. That deserves investigation, prosecution, and reform. But cybercrime itself is global, distributed, and technologically fluid. The geography of an attack can tell us something about infrastructure. It cannot, by itself, tell us the identity of the criminal. And that distinction is exactly what this series is asking viewers to learn. Don't turn data about infrastructure into stereotypes about people. Follow the evidence, then follow it one step further. This slide contains one of the most important ideas in this entire episode. Cybercrime is organized. It is not national. We have just looked at where attacks appear to originate. Now we need to understand why that data cannot simply be translated into the nationality of the criminal. The first point is crucial. Infrastructure can be rented, compromised, or hijacked. Cybercriminals can use servers, proxies, and infected devices in countries where neither they nor their victims are located. Europol has documented criminal services that deliberately provide access to compromised devices and IP addresses around the world to conceal the real origin of attacks. Europol. So an IP address can tell investigators where traffic appears to come from. It doesn't automatically tell them who is behind it. Then comes the money. Cybercrime has increasingly developed its own service economy. One group may develop malware. Another may obtain access. Another may operate infrastructure. Another may conduct the fraud. And another may specialize in laundering the proceeds. Europol's Operation Endgame demonstrates just how international these networks have become, with investigations involving multiple countries and infrastructure spread across jurisdictions. And that brings us to the third point. Attribution is specialist forensic work. Cybersecurity investigators don't determine the identity of an attacker by asking what nationality they look like. They examine digital evidence, infrastructure, malware, command and control systems, financial transactions, online identities, communication patterns, and links between separate criminal operations. In fact, Europol describes international investigations that combine digital forensics, intelligence sharing, and financial investigation to connect online personas with real-world individuals. So when someone says, cybercrime comes from Nigeria, the correct response is, which cybercrime? Which dataset? What does origin mean? Is it the attacker's location? The server? The compromised machine? The proxy? The financial destination? Or the person ultimately identified by investigators? Those distinctions matter. Because if we turn infrastructure statistics into national stereotypes, we're no longer doing research. We're doing prejudice with numbers. Nigeria has a real cybercrime problem. It needs serious enforcement, education, and institutional reform. But the evidence also shows that cybercrime operates through international infrastructure and specialized criminal networks. So the lesson from this layer is simple. Don't ask what nationality the crime looks like. Ask how the network works. Because in cyberspace, the person behind the keyboard, the server carrying the traffic, the victim receiving the attack, and the account receiving the money can all be in different countries. That's not a Nigerian crime. That's a global criminal architecture. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the GrioWave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Don't build alone. Join the GrioWave Inner Circle and connect with a community focused on real execution and transformation. Scan the QR code to begin. Every crime we've examined so far has one problem in common. Eventually, somebody has to deal with the money. Drugs generate revenue. Cybercrime generates revenue. Fraud generates revenue. Human trafficking generates revenue. Corruption generates revenue. But criminals cannot simply walk into a bank and announce, "This is the money I made from crime." They need to make the proceeds usable while concealing where they came from. That is where money laundering enters the picture. The Financial Action Task Force describes the classic process through three broad stages: placement, layering, and integration. Money enters the financial system. Transactions are used to obscure its origins, and the funds can ultimately re-enter the legitimate economy appearing to have a lawful source. And here's the important point for our investigation. Money laundering is not a Nigerian phenomenon. It is not an African phenomenon. It is a consequence of profit-generating crime, wherever that crime exists. The FATF explicitly notes that money laundering can occur practically anywhere in the world, because criminals look for financial and business environments that can help them move or conceal illicit proceeds. That means our map is about to change. We've been following the criminals. Now we're going to follow the money. Because this is where different criminal economies begin to converge. The drug trafficker needs to move proceeds. The online fraudster needs to convert stolen funds. The corrupt official needs to conceal illicit wealth. The organized crime group needs to transform criminal revenue into assets it can actually use. And suddenly, completely different crimes can begin touching the same financial infrastructure. UNODC describes this as part of a much wider global criminal economy involving financial institutions, virtual asset services, informal value transfer systems, professional intermediaries, and other channels. So the question becomes much more uncomfortable. If crime is global, where does the money become legitimate looking? And that is a very different question from what nationality was the person arrested? Because the person who commits the original crime and the person who helps disguise the proceeds may be completely different people. They may even be in different countries. This is why following the money is so powerful. It moves us away from stereotypes and toward the infrastructure that allows criminal wealth to survive. So in this layer, we're going to stop looking at the street. We're going into banks, companies, property, financial centers, professional services, and cross-border transactions. Because if you really want to understand organized crime, don't just ask who stole the money. Ask how the money became invisible. Now we arrive at perhaps the most uncomfortable part of our investigation. We've followed the drugs. We've followed the cyber attacks. Now we're following the money. And look at where the evidence takes us. The 2025 Financial Secrecy Index places the United States at number 1, followed by Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, Luxembourg, Germany, the Netherlands, South Korea, Guernsey, and Japan. That does not mean these countries are money laundering countries, or that their citizens are criminals. That's not what the index measures. The Tax Justice Network measures how much a jurisdiction's laws and financial system enable financial secrecy, combined with the scale of financial services it provides internationally. A high ranking, therefore, indicates a jurisdiction plays a significant role in enabling financial secrecy, not that every transaction there is illicit. And that distinction is critical, because we've spent this entire series asking whether it is fair to take the criminal behavior of some Nigerians and turn it into a description of Nigeria. So we have to apply exactly the same intellectual standard here. We cannot look at this map and say, Americans are money launderers. That would be absurd. We cannot say, the Swiss are criminals. Equally absurd. What we can say is that these jurisdictions occupy important positions within the global financial system, and some of their legal and financial structures provide greater opportunities for financial secrecy. That is a completely different claim. And it brings us to the central question. If criminal money needs somewhere to hide, what kind of financial infrastructure makes that possible? Banks, companies, trusts, investment structures, property, professional intermediaries, cross-border financial services. The criminal who generates the money and the financial system through which that money moves may be thousands of miles apart. And this is where the Nigerian stereotype becomes particularly interesting. Nigeria certainly has money laundering problems. Nigerian criminals participate in laundering illicit proceeds. But Nigeria does not control the global financial infrastructure through which illicit wealth can be concealed. The 2025 index places no African jurisdiction in its top 10, while several of the world's largest and most sophisticated financial centers appear prominently. That does not prove that money laundering happens only outside Africa. It demonstrates something more important. The infrastructure of global financial secrecy is overwhelmingly international. So when we investigate crime, we need to stop asking only, who committed the crime? We also need to ask, what systems allowed the proceeds to move? Because the person who commits the original crime may be visible. The financial infrastructure that helps conceal the proceeds can be far less visible. And if we're serious about fighting organized crime, we have to investigate both, not just the criminal on the street, the system around the money. Now I want us to look carefully at this chart, because this is where the conversation about crime, money, and national stereotypes becomes much more interesting. The source is the Tax Justice Network's 2025 Financial Secrecy Index. At number 1 is the United States, followed by Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, Luxembourg, Germany, the Netherlands, South Korea, Guernsey, and Japan. Now before anyone misunderstands what this chart means, let me make something absolutely clear. This is not a chart saying these countries are criminal. It does not mean that Americans, Swiss, Japanese, or Germans are money launderers. The Financial Secrecy Index measures something much more specific. The extent to which jurisdictions' laws, regulations, and financial systems contribute to global financial secrecy, combined with the scale of financial services they provide internationally. In other words, we're examining infrastructure, not nationality, and that distinction is essential to everything we're doing in this series. Imagine if we applied the stereotype logic to this chart. We could say, the United States is number 1, therefore Americans are criminals. Obviously, that would be nonsense. We could say, Switzerland is number 2, therefore Swiss people are money launderers. Again, nonsense. So why would it be intellectually acceptable to look at Nigerian involvement in fraud or drug trafficking and make the same leap about 230 million people? It isn't. But there is another important lesson here. The world's financial system is not simply a collection of isolated national economies. It is a network. Money can be generated in one country, transferred through another, held through a company registered somewhere else, invested through another jurisdiction, and ultimately controlled by someone living thousands of miles away. Research into offshore ownership structures has repeatedly shown that major developed economies and sophisticated financial centers can function as important conduits and destinations for international capital, rather than the simplistic image of money disappearing only into small tropical tax havens. So when we investigate illicit wealth, we need to ask a bigger question. Who generates the money? Who moves it? Who provides the legal and financial structures? And who ultimately benefits from it? Because the person who commits the original crime and the financial infrastructure that helps conceal or move the proceeds may be completely different actors. That is why this chart matters. It doesn't prove that these jurisdictions are laundering every criminal's money. It shows us that financial secrecy is a global structural issue, concentrated heavily in some of the world's most important financial centers. And that brings us back to the Nigerian stereotype. Nigeria has criminals. So does every country represented on this chart. The question is whether we judge nations by their criminals, or whether we finally learn to distinguish people, crime, institutions, and infrastructure. Because if we want to understand criminal wealth, we have to follow the money all the way to the systems that make it possible to disappear. Up to this point, we have been talking about systems. Now let's put some receipts on the table. Not rumors, not social media accusations, not stereotypes, documented cases involving major financial institutions, companies, and international financial networks. Start with Danske Bank. Between 2007 and 2015, around 200 billion euros in payments passed through its Estonian branch's non-resident portfolio. Danske's own investigation found major failures in governance and anti-money laundering controls, and the bank later pleaded guilty in the United States to bank fraud conspiracy and agreed to forfeit $2 billion. But notice the wording. 200 billion euros flowed through the system. That does not mean 200 billion euros was proven to be criminal money. Danske itself said a significant part was expected to be suspicious, but the entire 200 billion euros should not be described as confirmed money laundering. That distinction matters. Now consider Wirecard. In 2020, the German payments company collapsed after it emerged that approximately 1.9 billion euros supposedly held in trustee accounts could not be accounted for. Then there are the Panama Papers. In 2016, more than 11.5 million leaked documents exposed a vast network of offshore companies and financial structures involving people and entities across the world. Importantly, an offshore company is not automatically illegal. The significance of the leak was what it revealed about secrecy, ownership, and the ability to move wealth across jurisdictions. And finally, the Russian laundromat. Investigations found that an estimated $20.8 billion was moved out of Russia between 2010 and 2014 through a complex network involving shell companies and financial institutions. Now step back. What do these cases have in common? They demonstrate that sophisticated financial crime does not necessarily operate from a dark alley. It can move through banks, companies, shell structures, professional services, international payments, and legitimate financial infrastructure. And that is the point of this slide. We're not saying everyone in these countries is corrupt. We're not saying every bank employee was involved. We're not even saying every transaction in these cases was criminal. We're showing something more important. The infrastructure of global finance can be exploited by organized crime on a massive scale. So when someone tells you that Nigerians are uniquely associated with financial crime, ask them to look at the evidence. Nigeria has criminals, but so does Denmark, Germany, Russia, Britain, the United States, and virtually every other country. The difference is that some criminal activity becomes a national stereotype, while other cases become described as a corporate scandal, regulatory failure, or financial crime investigation. That difference in language matters, because the question isn't, which nationality has criminals? We already know the answer. Every nationality. The real question is, why do some criminals become a stereotype for millions of people, while others become a footnote in the history of global finance? Now let's step back from individual scandals and look at the scale of the problem. The estimate on this slide is enormous. Between 800 billion and 2 trillion US dollars potentially laundered globally each year. That figure has been widely associated with the long-standing UNODC-IMF estimate of roughly 2 to 5% of global GDP. But there is an important qualification. This is an estimate, not an audited global total. Money laundering is deliberately hidden, so measuring its true scale is extremely difficult. More recent UN material has also used different estimates, including around $1.6 trillion, or 2.7% of global GDP, illustrating just how uncertain the measurement is. So don't focus only on the exact number. Focus on the scale, hundreds of billions of dollars, potentially trillions, moving through the global economy in connection with illicit activity. And that tells us something fundamental. Money laundering isn't some obscure side activity performed by a few criminals in isolation. It is a global financial problem. Think about the crimes we've already examined. The drug trafficker needs somewhere to put the proceeds. The cybercriminal needs to convert stolen digital wealth into usable assets. The corrupt official needs to conceal the source of illicit wealth. The organized crime group needs to transform criminal revenue into something that looks legitimate. And that is where the financial system becomes part of the story. Banks, companies, property, investment structures, professional intermediaries, offshore entities, digital payment systems. The exact mechanisms vary, but the objective remains the same. Separate the money from its criminal origin. And here's the uncomfortable part. The person who generated the illicit money may be nowhere near the jurisdiction where that money eventually appears. That means crime can be local at the beginning and global by the time the money is integrated. A fraud can begin with a victim in Britain, involve an offender somewhere else, pass through several financial institutions, and eventually become an asset or investment in another country. So when we reduce financial crime to Nigerians are scammers, we are describing one small part of a much larger economic process. Nigeria absolutely has serious problems with fraud and illicit financial flows. But the laundering of criminal proceeds is not Nigerian, African, European, or American. It is global, and that is why this layer matters so much. Because if we really want to fight organized crime, we cannot only arrest the person who generated the money. We have to understand where the money goes, who moves it, which systems it passes through, and where it ultimately becomes usable wealth. Follow the crime, then follow the money. Because sometimes the most revealing part of a criminal network isn't where the crime begins. It's where the money finally becomes invisible. Now we reach the fourth and perhaps most uncomfortable layer of this map, human trafficking. And I want to begin by challenging one of the biggest misconceptions about this crime. When people hear human trafficking, they often imagine a kidnapping. Someone is dragged across a border, locked in a room, and physically restrained. That happens, but it is only one part of the picture. Human trafficking can involve fraud, deception, coercion, exploitation, and abuse of vulnerability. It can involve sexual exploitation, forced labor, forced criminality, forced begging, forced marriage, and other forms of exploitation. And critically, it does not require an international border. A person can be trafficked within their own country. The latest UNODC global report examined detected trafficking cases across 156 countries and found that trafficking patterns are changing. Forced labor has become increasingly prominent, while trafficking for forced criminality is also emerging as a serious concern. So why does this matter to our conversation about Nigeria? Because this is where the narrative becomes particularly dangerous. Yes, Nigerians are involved in human trafficking networks. There are Nigerian trafficking networks. There are Nigerian victims. There are Nigerian perpetrators. We should not deny that. But Nigeria did not invent human trafficking. And Nigeria does not possess a monopoly on it. The UN's own data shows trafficking occurring across every major region of the world. In 2022, the detected victims came from an enormous range of circumstances, with forced labor accounting for 42% of detected victims whose exploitation type was recorded, compared with 36% for sexual exploitation. That changes the question. Instead of asking, which nationality are the traffickers, we should be asking, where are people being recruited? Where are they being exploited? Who profits? Which industries create the demand? Which borders, companies, financial systems, and criminal networks facilitate the movement of people and money? And perhaps most importantly, who are the victims? Because a Nigerian woman trafficked into sexual exploitation is not evidence that Nigerians are inherently criminal. She may actually be evidence of something completely different, that vulnerable people can be exploited by organized networks operating across borders. The 2024 UNODC report makes another important point. Children represented 38% of detected trafficking victims in 2022. That should immediately move this conversation away from stereotypes and towards systems. This episode is therefore not about pretending Nigeria has no problem. It does. The purpose is to put that problem into its global context. Because if we are serious about fighting trafficking, we cannot simply chase passports. We have to chase networks, demand, money, corruption, recruitment systems, and exploitation markets. Human trafficking is not a Nigerian problem. It is a global business, built on human vulnerability. And if we want to dismantle it, we have to examine the entire business model, not just the nationality of the person caught at the bottom of it. This is where the map becomes particularly important. Because if we have spent the first three layers looking at products, technology, and money, we now arrive at something much more fundamental: people. And unlike drugs or stolen data, human beings are not commodities that simply move from point A to point B. They are people whose vulnerability is being exploited for profit. Look carefully at this map. We have Europe and Central Asia. We have the Middle East and North Africa. We have Sub-Saharan Africa. And these are not isolated national problems. They are interconnected trafficking corridors. The UNODC's 2024 global report recorded victims from at least 162 nationalities being trafficked to 128 destination countries in 2022. That is an extraordinary number of nationalities and destinations. So let us pause on what that actually means. There is no credible evidence here for the idea that human trafficking is somehow a uniquely Nigerian phenomenon. In fact, the UNODC data shows that African victims accounted for 31% of detected cross-border trafficking flows, making Africa the origin region connected to the widest range of destinations. Those flows primarily extend toward Europe and the Middle East. But there is an important distinction we must make. Being a major origin region is not the same thing as being a major criminal region. A person can originate from a particular country because they are vulnerable to exploitation. That does not mean their nationality explains the crime. And this is where our narrative often goes wrong. We see Nigerians, Ghanaians, Ethiopians, Somalis, or other Africans appearing in trafficking cases abroad and ask, why are these people trafficking? But perhaps the more intelligent question is, why are these people being trafficked? Where are they being exploited? And who is paying for the exploitation? Because trafficking requires a market. It requires recruitment. It requires transportation. It requires places of exploitation. And, ultimately, someone has to pay. The UNODC also reports that approximately 74% of traffickers in analyzed cases operated within organized crime groups. So this is not simply a story about an individual Nigerian, Romanian, British, Syrian, or Ghanaian criminal. It is about organized networks operating across jurisdictions. And that distinction matters enormously, because when we reduce a transnational criminal network to the nationality of the person caught at one end of the chain, we may identify a participant, but completely miss the system. Look again at the number at the bottom: 162 nationalities, 128 destination countries. That is not a Nigerian story. That is a global trafficking system. And that is precisely what Beyond the Label is asking us to examine. Not who fits the stereotype, but what the evidence actually tells us. There are two numbers on this slide, 25% and approximately 40%. Together, they tell us something far more disturbing than any stereotype about nationality. According to the UNODC Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, the number of detected trafficking victims in 2022 was 25% higher than in 2019, before the COVID-19 pandemic. Compared with the exceptional low point of 2020, detections were 43% higher. Now, there is an important caveat. These are detected victims, not every victim in existence. Human trafficking is deliberately hidden, and detection depends on whether authorities identify victims and whether countries report their data. So we should not interpret the 25% increase as meaning that trafficking itself necessarily increased by exactly 25%. What we can say is this: more victims are being identified, and that should concern us. But the second number is even more difficult to ignore. The UNODC reports that 38% of detected trafficking victims worldwide in 2022 were children, roughly 2 in every 5. That proportion has risen dramatically from about 13% when UNODC began collecting comparable global data in 2004. Think about that. This isn't simply a story about migration. It isn't simply a story about borders. And it certainly isn't a story about one nationality. Children are being pulled into global systems of exploitation. And the forms of exploitation are changing. Girls detected as trafficking victims are disproportionately identified in sexual exploitation, while boys are frequently detected in forced labor and other forms of exploitation, including forced criminality and forced begging. That last point deserves attention. Because trafficking isn't always about someone being sold into prostitution. A child can be recruited and forced to commit crimes. A person can be trapped in forced labor. Someone can be exploited domestically. Someone can be deceived into traveling for a job that doesn't exist. And someone can be moved across borders specifically because another person believes their vulnerability can generate profit. So when we ask whether Nigeria has a trafficking problem, the honest answer is yes. But that is not the end of the analysis. The bigger question is, why are vulnerable people becoming profitable commodities in the first place? Poverty matters. Conflict matters. Migration matters. Demand matters. Weak institutions matter. Organized crime matters. And increasingly, digital platforms and online recruitment can matter too. This is why Beyond the Label refuses to reduce the discussion to passports. The evidence points toward a global system of exploitation. And if nearly 2 in 5 detected victims are children, then perhaps the most important question isn't which country produces the traffickers. It is, what kind of global system allows children to become profitable targets? That is the question this episode wants us to confront. When most people hear the words human trafficking, what picture immediately comes to mind? A border, a smuggling route, a criminal network, moving vulnerable people from one country to another. That picture exists, but it is not the whole picture. In fact, the UNODC's 2024 Global Report gives us a number that completely changes how we should think about this crime: 58%. In 2022, 58% of detected trafficking victims were trafficked within their own national borders. In other words, they did not need to cross an international border to become victims of trafficking. That is enormously important, because trafficking is often presented as fundamentally a migration problem. But the data tells us it is also, and perhaps primarily, a problem of exploitation. Someone can be recruited in their own city, transported to another part of their own country, controlled through threats, deception, debt, violence, or abuse of vulnerability, and exploited without ever showing a passport. So when somebody says, Nigerians are involved in human trafficking, our response should not be to deny the existence of Nigerian trafficking networks. That would be dishonest. Our response should be yes, now show us the entire system. Because domestic trafficking exists across much of the world. UNODC reports that domestic trafficking is prevalent in most regions, and in several regions, more than 70% of detected victims are domestically trafficked. And there is another important implication. If we only look for trafficking at airports, ports, and international borders, we are looking in the wrong places for a large proportion of the crime. The victim could be living in the same country as the trafficker. The exploitation could be happening in the same city. The money could be circulating entirely within the domestic economy. And the people involved could share the same language, nationality, and community. That destroys one of the most persistent myths about trafficking, that the foreigner is necessarily the trafficker, and the border is necessarily where the crime happens. The reality is much more complicated. And notice something else. This finding actually makes our argument stronger, not weaker. We are not saying Nigeria has no trafficking problem. We are saying stop using individual Nigerian cases to construct a theory about Nigerians as a people. The evidence does not support that conclusion. Human trafficking is a global crime of exploitation, and much of it happens close to home. So the next time you hear a sensational story about a Nigerian trafficking case overseas, remember this number, 58%. Because before we ask who crossed the border, we should first ask who is being exploited, and where is the exploitation actually happening. That is how we move beyond the label and into the evidence. We have spent this episode looking at 4 different layers of transnational crime: drugs, cybercrime, money laundering, and human trafficking. Now I want to zoom out, because there is another question we need to ask. Who does the international financial system actually flag as high risk? And this is where we need to be precise. The FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, does not produce a list of criminal countries. Its gray list identifies jurisdictions under increased monitoring because of strategic deficiencies in their systems for combating money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. And the blacklist is a much more serious category: jurisdictions subject to a FATF call for action. As of June 2026, that list contains just 3 jurisdictions: North Korea, Iran, and Myanmar. Now look at the left side. As of the FATF's June 2026 statement, there were 22 jurisdictions under increased monitoring. They span multiple regions: Africa, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And here is the part particularly relevant to our Nigerian narrative. Nigeria is not on that list. Neither is South Africa. In October 2025, the FATF removed both countries from increased monitoring after they completed their respective action plans. That does not mean Nigeria has solved every problem involving corruption, fraud, money laundering, or organized crime. It plainly hasn't. But it does mean we should be extremely careful about using international financial risk classifications to reinforce a simplistic story about Nigerians being uniquely criminal. The evidence does not support that. And there is another lesson here. Look at the countries currently under increased monitoring. They include European countries, Asian countries, Middle Eastern countries, African countries, Caribbean jurisdictions, Latin American countries. Crime and financial risk do not respect race. They do not respect geography. And they certainly do not respect the stereotypes we sometimes attach to particular nationalities. The FATF itself says that increased monitoring means jurisdictions have committed to address identified strategic deficiencies. It is a risk management and reform mechanism, not a declaration that the people of that country are criminals. That distinction matters enormously for this series. Because our argument is not Nigeria has no crime. Our argument is crime exists everywhere. So why are some nationalities routinely turned into the face of global crime? That is a much harder question, and it forces us to examine something deeper than nationality: institutions, financial infrastructure, beneficial ownership, shell companies, professional intermediaries, enforcement capacity, and the movement of illicit money. If we genuinely want to understand global crime, we cannot simply look at the person holding the suitcase. We have to look at the system capable of receiving what is inside it. And that is where this investigation is heading next. We have spent this episode looking at 4 different layers: drugs, cybercrime, money laundering, human trafficking. Now we put them together. And something important happens when we stop looking at individual countries and start looking at the global system. The pattern becomes much harder to turn into a nationality story. North America appears in our data through cybercrime and financial infrastructure. Europe and Central Asia appear across multiple layers: cybercrime, financial conduits, and trafficking corridors. The Middle East and North Africa appear in drug production and trafficking networks. East Asia and the Pacific appear in financial and increasingly sophisticated technology-enabled criminal ecosystems. South America remains central to the production of major plant-based drugs, such as cocaine. And Sub-Saharan Africa appears prominently in trafficking routes, and, increasingly, as a transit and destination environment for several forms of organized crime. The point is not to declare one region good and another bad. It is almost the opposite. Every major region participates somewhere in the architecture of global organized crime, and that distinction is critical. A country can be a producer, another can be a transit hub, another can provide the financial infrastructure, another can provide the technology, another can provide the consumer market, another can provide the professional services or corporate structures through which illicit proceeds are concealed. The criminal economy works precisely because these functions can be separated geographically. The UN describes transnational organized crime as a multi-billion-dollar industry operating across borders and involving drugs, human trafficking, cybercrime, corruption, and money laundering. United Nations. And contemporary UNODC research shows just how sophisticated this convergence has become. Criminal groups increasingly provide specialized services to other criminals, creating something resembling an illicit service economy. UNODC. That changes the question we began this episode with. Instead of asking, which country has the criminals, we should be asking, what role does each jurisdiction play in the criminal supply chain? Because the person transporting the drugs may not be the person producing them. The hacker may not be the person laundering the money. The trafficker may not control the final market. And the person committing the crime may not be the person receiving the greatest financial benefit. That is the central lesson of this map. Crime has no single capital. It has networks, markets, infrastructure, facilitators, and consumers. So when Nigerians are collectively labeled as drug dealers, fraudsters, or traffickers, we should ask a simple question. Where is the rest of the supply chain? Who produced it? Who transported it? Who financed it? Who received it? Who consumed it? Who provided the infrastructure? And who made the greatest profit? Because once you ask those questions, the Nigerian stereotype starts looking much less like an explanation of global crime, and much more like an incomplete description of one small part of a much larger system. That is what it means to go beyond the label. Crime doesn't have a capital. It has infrastructure. That is the thesis of this entire episode. We often talk about crime as though it belongs somewhere. A particular country, a particular continent, a particular ethnicity, a particular type of person. We search for the criminal, and then attach the crime to the identity of the criminal. But organized crime does not work that way. Look at everything we have just mapped. The drugs may be produced in one country, transported through another, financed somewhere else, sold in another market, and the proceeds eventually enter legitimate financial systems somewhere completely different. Cybercrime works in much the same way. The attacker can sit in one country, rent infrastructure in several others, compromise victims across the world, use cryptocurrency or financial intermediaries to move the proceeds, and disappear behind layers of digital infrastructure. Human trafficking follows another version of the same logic. There are origin communities, recruiters, transport networks, destination markets, corrupt facilitators and financial channels, different locations, different people, one connected system. And that is why infrastructure matters more than stereotypes. A passport does not create a criminal network. Infrastructure does. Banks, companies, ports, airports, digital platforms, cryptocurrency exchanges, professional services, shell companies, real estate, communication networks, corrupt officials, and, ultimately, markets willing to pay. This is also why simplistic narratives about African crime can be so misleading. When a Nigerian commits fraud in London, the Nigerian may be the visible actor, but the transaction still depends on a much larger ecosystem: telecommunications, banking infrastructure, digital platforms, identity systems, payment networks, and a victim economy. The same principle applies everywhere. We should therefore stop asking only, where are the criminals from? And start asking, what infrastructure allowed the crime to happen? Who supplied it? Who enabled it? Who moved the money? Who provided the market? Who benefited? Those questions take us beyond the label. Because organized crime does not need a capital city. It needs connections. And wherever those connections exist, criminal economies can emerge. The uncomfortable conclusion is this: if we want to understand global crime, we cannot simply hunt for criminals. We have to map the infrastructure that makes criminal enterprise possible. Take a moment and think about the map you carry in your head. When you hear the words drug trafficking, Where do you imagine it comes from? When you hear cybercrime, which countries immediately come to mind? When you hear money laundering, who do you picture as the source? And when you hear human trafficking, where does your mind place the problem? Now ask yourself a more uncomfortable question. Whose map are you actually using? Because throughout this episode, we have deliberately moved away from the question of who looks like a criminal, and toward the question of how the system actually works. We saw cocaine production concentrated in South America, but the enormous profits are generated across a much wider global market. We saw synthetic drug production associated with the Middle East, but the demand, distribution, and money extend far beyond that region. We saw cyber attacks originating from multiple jurisdictions, demonstrating that digital crime has no meaningful national boundary. We saw financial secrecy concentrated in some of the world's wealthiest financial centers, and we saw human trafficking operating both across borders and, surprisingly often, entirely within them. So the map becomes more complicated. The country where something starts is not necessarily the country where the greatest profit is made. The person who commits the visible offense is not necessarily the person who controls the infrastructure. And the place where money appears is not necessarily where the crime originated. That distinction matters, because if our mental map stops at the visible offender, we can completely miss the institutions, markets, technologies, financial systems, and professional networks that allow the crime to scale. This is not about pretending that geography doesn't matter. It does. It is about refusing to confuse location with ownership, origin with control, or visibility with responsibility. So before we recap the 4 layers, hold on to one question. When you point to a place and say, that is where this crime comes from, what evidence is actually behind your finger? That is where the real investigation begins. Before we move forward, let's bring the entire map back into focus. 4 layers. 4 different forms of criminal infrastructure, and one conclusion that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Crime does not belong neatly to one country, one continent, or one type of society. First, drug trafficking. We have seen 2 very different production systems. Cocaine is largely plant-based, geographically concentrated in South America, while synthetic drugs such as Captagon emerged through a very different industrial and political environment in the Middle East. But neither story ends where production begins. The profits, consumers, logistics, and financial networks extend far beyond the production zone. Second, cybercrime. Here, geography almost breaks down completely. Servers can be rented in one country, operated from another, target victims somewhere else, and route proceeds through an entirely different financial system. The important lesson is that an IP address is not necessarily a nationality. Third, money laundering. This may be the most important layer because it connects the others. Criminal proceeds need somewhere to go. And the evidence we examined points repeatedly towards sophisticated financial centers, offshore structures, banks, shell companies, and secrecy jurisdictions. The uncomfortable question is not simply, where was the crime committed, but where was the money made usable? Finally, human trafficking. This is where the popular image can be particularly misleading. We often imagine trafficking as an international smuggling operation. Yet the data shows that most detected victims were trafficked within their own countries. The crime can happen without a border being crossed at all. So look at the 4 layers together. Drugs require production and distribution. Cybercrime requires digital infrastructure. Money laundering requires financial infrastructure. Trafficking requires networks of exploitation and movement. Different crimes, different mechanisms, but they share something fundamental. They depend on infrastructure. And infrastructure is rarely confined to the place where the crime becomes visible. That is the central lesson of this episode. If we only ask which country is responsible, we may find an answer that is technically correct but strategically incomplete. The better question is, who provides the infrastructure that allows the crime to scale, move, hide, and ultimately become profitable? That question takes us beyond stereotypes, and much closer to the real architecture of global crime. Everything we have discussed in this episode rests on one principle: follow the evidence. The claims on these slides are not based on intuition, social media narratives, or assumptions about which countries are good or bad. They are drawn from reports, data sets, investigations, and documented cases. The UNODC World Drug Report 2025 provides the foundation for our discussion of cocaine production and global drug use. Its data helps establish the scale of the market and the concentration of production. For the Captagon story, We have used the UNODC June 2025 assessment, alongside reporting and analysis from organizations including RUSI, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Foreign Policy, and the Stimson Center. This matters because Syria's role in the synthetic drug economy is complex, particularly following the fall of the Assad regime. For cybercrime, we use the Kaspersky and Statista data on tracked cyber attack origins. Here, an important caveat is that, quote, origin in cybercrime data does not necessarily mean the attacker's physical location or nationality. It can refer to technical attribution and observed infrastructure. That distinction is critical. The Financial Secrecy section draws on the Tax Justice Network's Financial Secrecy Index 2025, which examines jurisdictions through the lens of financial secrecy and the scale of financial activity. Then we move into documented financial scandals: Danske Bank, Wirecard, the Panama Papers, and the Russian laundromat. These cases are particularly useful because they demonstrate that financial crime is not simply theoretical. There are paper trails, bank records, company structures, leaked documents, regulatory investigations, and court proceedings. For human trafficking, the primary reference is the UNODC Global Report on Trafficking in Persons 2024, which helps us understand both the scale and changing characteristics of trafficking. And finally, the FATF June 2026 update provides the framework for understanding jurisdictions under increased monitoring and those classified as high risk. So this slide is more than a bibliography. It is the audit trail behind the argument. And that distinction matters because the purpose of Beyond the Label is not to replace one stereotype with another. It is to challenge assumptions with evidence. If the evidence takes us somewhere uncomfortable, that is precisely where the investigation should go. Every episode should leave us with a question that is harder than the one we started with. In this episode, we asked a broad question. Where does global crime actually live? We followed the trail from drugs, to cybercrime, to money laundering, to human trafficking. And what we discovered was that criminal infrastructure rarely respects the borders we use to explain it. But now, we are going to bring the investigation much closer to home. Nigeria. Few countries have had their international image so heavily shaped by one particular word: 419. For many people around the world, especially those who encounter Nigeria through internet fraud stories, the number has become almost shorthand for an entire nation. But where did that association come from? Why did the Nigerian fraud stereotype become so powerful? And perhaps more importantly, how did a particular form of fraud become attached to the identity of millions of people who had nothing to do with it? That is the case file for our episode. We are going to examine the history behind the label, not simply repeat the familiar story. We will look at the economic pressures that shaped the environment in which advance fee fraud developed. We will examine the role of the diaspora, the expansion of email and digital communications, and the evolution of fraud from relatively simple advance fee schemes into increasingly sophisticated online operations. But there is another part of the investigation that matters just as much: the world outside Nigeria. Fraud requires two sides. There is someone sending the message, but there is also someone receiving it. There are people creating fraudulent schemes, but there are also financial systems, telecommunications networks, payment platforms, social media ecosystems, and international markets through which the proceeds can move. So we need to resist two equally simplistic explanations. The first says, Nigerians are criminals. The second says, Nigeria has nothing to do with it. Neither explanation is good enough. The real story is more complicated, and therefore more revealing. How did history, economics, technology, opportunity, desperation, entrepreneurship, and organized criminal behavior intersect? And how did a relatively small group of offenders become powerful enough to influence the reputation of an entire country? That is the history nobody explains. Next, we go beyond the label. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.